All right, so book 3, here we go into Numbers. And the fourth book, book 4 of the Pentateuch. So a little introduction here to the background. It kind of starts off as a sequel to Leviticus. And I don't say that in the most positive light, because if Leviticus was a little bit of a tough read, Numbers starts off that way as well. So it can be a little bit rough, but it gets better. The scope is 40 years from in the 13th century BC. So they start off there in the desert of Sinai, and they end up on the plains of Moab on the eve of an invasion. It's the fourth book of the Pentateuch. It gets its name from the census that takes place at the beginning of the book. So it's correctly called Numbers because it is lots of numbers there to begin. So we have that at the first passage here, telling you shall take up a census. But then it really ends up being a journey story. So it starts off with a lot of numbers and counting, and then it ends up being a journey story. And there's kind of 3 episodes, if you will. There's the episode on Sinai, there's the episode in the wilderness, and then there's the episode on the plains of Moab. So kind of 3 parts. I was going to put that up on a slide too, but I didn't get that up there. So 3 parts as we go through this journey. So let's go back a bit to Genesis, because we're kind of picking up with these tribes. Also, before I get into the tribes, there is kind of a transition here then in this book. Remember that in Exodus, they weren't really they didn't fight at all. They just ran. They escaped from Egypt. And so they were just kind of this nomadic people. And what the book of Numbers is it really forms the people of God rather than just kind of nomadic people who are out there who just escaped as slaves, but now they are organizing themselves and preparing themselves and getting themselves ready for mission, ready for conquering the land that God had promised them. And yeah, it feels a little bit like maybe, I don't know, like Lord of the Rings or something, where the battles are, the armies are assembling and they're getting ready for battle. That's a little bit what it reads like. But then there's also, it reads kind of like you'd watch Lord of the Rings or something on television, where there's these commercial breaks where you get like this adventure and then pause, commercial break. Let's talk about the law for a moment and let's remind people what we're doing. So there's the second census, there's an extra law here and there. That's kind of how it reads. It feels, at least to me, a little bit like getting ready for battle, watching this movie on television with some commercial breaks, if you will. So now let's get to the 12 tribes of Israel. Remember that we had Jacob and Laban tricked Jacob into marrying Leah. Remember, Rachel was beautiful, well-formed, and Leah had beautiful eyes, or tricky eyes, or clouded eyes, depending on the translation. Remember, I was talking about in Genesis that this pandemic, with all of us wearing masks, this is the time for Leah. Hooray, because all that matters is eyes. So remember, we have all the various children that come then from Jacob. So we have Jacob and Leah's maid, Jacob and Rachel's maid, Jacob and Leah, Jacob and Rachel. And this was all put together in that song from Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Remember that I like so much? And we have the lyrics here. This is just a review. Jacob and Sons, men of the soil, the sheaf and crook. But then it goes through the names of the tribes, which is really helpful to remember their names, actually. So you have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Naphtali, Dan, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. So the 12 tribes of Israel then get their names, get their inheritance from these 12 people. They track their ancestry back to Reuben or Simeon or Judah or Issachar. So when you hear about the tribes, that's where they come from, Jacob and his offspring from 4 different sources. So then when we get the numbers, we then get the organization of what their numbers are. Now, Joseph splits into the 2 sons there, Ephraim and Manasseh. So we have those 2 tribes then. And so we cross off Joseph in our count of 12. And we also cross off Levi because those are the Levites. They will not be given land. They are the ones that travel, the priestly group that is meant to be welcomed in all the tribes. It takes care of the worship there in the tribes. So when you count the 12 tribes that are given land, then it's to these 12 tribes. Remember that Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, and Paul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. And when we get to the numbers, then in the first census, this is what we have. All the people that are counted, this is in thousands. This is summarizing the first book of the first chapter in Numbers. We go through all of these numbers, 59,000 and 54.4 and all those. There is this counting, this census of the people. Now, so then if we go to where they will line up, this doesn't happen in Numbers, but eventually when we get past Judges and we get into Joshua and Judges, the 1st and 2nd Samuel, this is where the tribes then end up. So Judah, Simeon, Reuben, Gad, Dan, Manasseh. That is where they end up settling, and that's how the land is divided. Which is, we hear that in Joshua. If you recall from our talk in Joshua, that was the book of, instead of divide and conquer, it was conquer and divide. So they conquer the land in Joshua, and then they divide the land, and we hear about the territories. That is all marked out, and if you want to review that, you can go back to one of our first Bible studies way back when we talked about Joshua. So this is where they are going to end up. And those are those numbers. And remember, this was called the Promised Land. So when you enter the land of Canaan, this is what shall be given to you. This is the territory. Yeah, so there, the boundaries, they do give the boundaries and then they divide it again in Joshua. Well, the boundaries of the whole promised land is put there in chapter 34 of Numbers, and then the subdividing happens later. So we've already talked about that. All right, so now we'll talk about So that's the first part, Numbers. Now, where the real crux of the book is it's talking about this route that happens in the book of Numbers. So how do they then get from Mount Sinai, which is where we start? The star then is the goal. That's where they want to go, because that's where God said, I will give you this land. We also see why there is so much strife currently and has been for generations in the Holy Land, and so much fighting is because the Jewish people, they look to the Bible and they say, this land was given to us by God. And then Muslims would say the same thing, I think, that they say, well, no, this is our land. This was given to us, not to you. And so they both believe that they have God-given rights to the land. And so that's why there's continues to be these fights, because they see that this is given to them by God. It's their God-given rights. So, but that's where we get the origin here, is from the scriptures. This land is your land. This land is your land. This land is my land. Okay, so as we start in Sinai, our first stop will be in the wilderness of Paran. Right there. Another title for the book of Numbers is called The Wilderness, which is, I think, the Jewish title of this book, which is a great also way to, it's a little bit more captivating than the title Numbers. It's also would be easier to find when you Google it, because when I like search for numbers in my computer, it like finds my my spreadsheet sheet program, which is called Numbers or whatever. It's a little hard to find Numbers. Wilderness would be easier to find, but they weren't thinking in terms of Google searching when they named the books of the Bible. But the wilderness is a good expression. It's also, I might get into this a little bit later as well, the spiritual sense of reading Numbers is it's this spiritual journey through the wilderness. And there's all this rebellion that happens with the people of God. And we can track, as well as we are looking at it and we're reading it in a spiritual sense. So there's the sense of reading it from the historical sense, and what's the first sense, what happened as it has been revealed to us. But then we also can take these words and apply them internally. That's the beauty of the scriptures, of how does my own spiritual life resemble what happened to the people of God in the wilderness. And so these themes of rebellion and God's faithfulness and God giving the law and all those things we are meant to pray about and consider, how does our journey as well resemble that? If we are all striving to get to the Holy Land, the holiest of lands, if you will, into heaven, what does our journey look like? What are those battles, those spiritual battles that we have in our own lives? What does that look like? So although there can be some, it sometimes can be difficult to read like battles and people being slain and all these things, that's tough for us moderns to read. We also keep in mind that what's the slaying and the battling that needs to happen in our lives for us to get to heaven. Zooming in there on the wilderness of Paran. And one of the things that happens with the people is that they grumble. They do not like it here in the wilderness. The people of Israel become a little bit like bratty kids or whatever. It's like, oh, it used to be so good back in Egypt. And so they are remembering these times. I love this passage from 11:5. We remember the fish we used to eat without cost, the melons, the cucumbers, the leeks. Oh, life was so good in Egypt. And God is like frustrated, like, come on now. I took you out of slavery and now you're complaining about what you're eating and whatever. Well, God provides. But one of my favorite comic strips is Calvin and Hobbes. And there's this bully here, and I think just he is so observant, so often. People get nostalgic about childhood, obviously never children. What a great passage. And I think that's a good memory, a way of thinking of the people in the wilderness, and they're thinking back of their fond days of Egypt. Oh, it was so good back then. It's like, did you forget what is going on? So they end up being in the wilderness of Paran for a long time. They end up being there for 40 years. Now, why were they in Paran, this wilderness, for 40 years? Now, again, spiritually, we can think of the 40 years, that connection with 40 and the 40 days like of Lent. So we're getting ready to enter into Lent, and the idea is we enter into that wilderness as well. And so there's that connection there. And so the 40 years are seen as a punishment, that they have to be in this wilderness for 40 years as a punishment. Now, why have they been punished? In chapter 13 of Numbers, we hear about God sending out 12 scouts, one from each of the tribes, of the 12 tribes of Israel. They will go out and they are going to scout out the Holy Land. They're going to go look at it. And he says they are to reconnoiter. That's a great word. They are to, in chapter 13, verse 2, it says, send men to reconnoiter the land of Canaan, which I am giving the Israelites. I think we need to use the word reconnoiter more frequently. And they go out, and then they return from there after so in chapter 13, verse 25, after reconnoitering the land for 40 days, they returned. They met Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelites in the desert of Paran at Kadesh, and made a report. And they told Moses, it does indeed flow with milk and honey, and here is its fruit. However, the people who are living there in the land are fierce, and the towns are fortified. And they say they're huge, and they are undefeatable. And but then Caleb and comes back and says, we can do it. Let's go. This is where I wanted to insert, but I couldn't figure out how to put it in exactly. But this is where I want to insert the picture of Andy Reid and the Super Bowl or whatever. And imagine Andy Reid talking to his coaches and saying, okay, how are we going to beat Tampa Bay? Or how are we going to beat, from last year, San Francisco? And imagine if his coaches came back like last year, San Francisco. Man, their defense is tough. There's no way. We can't beat them. We might as well just give them the ring. Andy Reid would say, you're fired. I didn't ask you if we can beat them. I said, how can we beat them? You know, that's kind of the message here. The scouts weren't sent out to figure out whether or not this was a good idea. They were sent to bring back a report. And so they were not trusting in the goodness of God. They thought these people are bigger than the power of God, therefore they are unconquerable, so we're not going to mess with them. That's the idea. And so it might seem like a bit of a harsh punishment, but if you say that something is bigger than God's power, that's blasphemy. I mean, how powerful is God? God is all powerful. Is anything impossible for God? No. And so when they come back and they doubt the goodness of God and the power of God, that's the issue. So it doesn't have to do with we do want to use discernment and say, whether or not this is a good idea. Should we do this or should we not do this? That is a very good thing to do, but that's not what God was sending them out to do at this point in time. As we look to, do like a capital campaign or something, you do a feasibility study and you say whether or not this is a good idea. Should we build a building, or should we do this thing to raise money? Or is it going to be successful? And then you do a feasibility study, and the feasibility study comes back and says, no, it's not a good idea. Let's not do it. Then you would hopefully take that advice and say, no, we're not going to do it, and back off of that. For God, the feasibility study had already been done. God says, I can do this. I got it. So go kind of assess and figure out how it's going to happen. And they doubt God's goodness. So the punishment then is that generation then will not enter the promised land. And basically, God is giving them what they want, which is a good spiritual reading of that as well. The people said, we don't want the Holy Land. It's too tough. We can't do it. And so God says, fine, then you won't enter it. In our journey to heaven, we might say, oh, it's too hard. I have to live a virtuous life. I have to do these things. I can't do it. The sin is too great and I can't conquer these things. And if we say that, God says, well, fine, then you don't have to go into the promised land either. You can go to hell. I give this to you, right? So we can end up in our spiritual lives outside of the promised land, doubting that God is all powerful, God is all loving, God can conquer even these things that stand in our way. When we doubt those things, God answers that and says, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to follow me, you don't have to, but you won't enter into the promised land. So that generation passes away without entering into the promised land. So we hear kind of a resolution from that. All those that grumbled will not enter, but Caleb and Joshua will enter in, because they did not doubt the Lord. There's also an interesting conversation here, a little bit of a side note, between Moses and God. And God, and this is in chapter 14, the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? How long will they refuse to believe in me despite all the signs I have performed for them? I will strike them with pestilence and wipe them out. And I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. And then Moses kind of intercedes and says, well, God, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. What if the Egyptians heard of this? You know, that people you just saved, and that's not going to go over very well. It's not going to be good for our public relations. So maybe we shouldn't do that. So it seems a little odd that we have this kind of conversation that's going on. But remember that this is a story, and it is a conversation, kind of talking about that power of intercession. And so the people of the time were not really concerned with this kind of personality or fickleness of God that disturbs us as modern readers. Like, what kind of God is this? But we have to kind of enter into that way of conversation with God. If I can move it into like the New Testament reading, we sometimes get troubled with that reading with Moses and, is it a Samaritan woman or whatever, where Jesus says it's not right to throw the food at table to the dogs. You know, it seems like an outright insulting thing that for Jesus to say to this woman. And then we hear this woman conversing and arguing with Jesus. It's that same kind of feel that God is conversing with his people and conversing in a language that they can understand. Was God really threatening to wipe out the people? I don't think that's the idea. It's the conversation that is happening between these two people in a culture that's very different than ours. So then we have in chapter 15, we have this rather important piece of this Sabbath breaker. So chapter 15, verse 32, while we are still here in this wilderness of Paran. While the Israelites were in the desert, a man was discovered gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who caught him at it brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. They didn't know what to be done with him. Then the Lord said to Moses, this man shall be put to death. Let the whole community stone him outside the camp. So the whole community led him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord had commanded him. So this is really the acting out, the putting into practice of Leviticus, of this person that broke the Sabbath. Again, part of the background, as we heard in Leviticus, is about the holiness of God and how we are called to be holy. And the community of Israel was to be a different community than the other communities. And so anyone that was violating what was holy, as God rested on the Sabbath day, so too must the people of God, that they are to be God-like, to preserve the holiness of the nation. Anyone that goes against that is to be cast out. That's the idea, the perseverance of the community, the holiness of the community. They were meant to be a people set apart. We still teach that, right? That we are called to be a people set apart. Now, we don't go and take people outside and stone them to death. But again, this is this evolution of the people. But we keep this in mind as well when we hear about the Pharisees and how upset they get with Jesus doing healing on the Sabbath and all these various things. This is the scripture that they are reading, and that they hear about this person who is just gathering wood. This person was cast out and stoned to death. They were trying to preserve what they had received. Now, Jesus brings this new understanding, this new meaning of what it means to be holy and what it means to be a holy community. But we still have that in a certain sense too, as Catholics, right? That if someone is obstinately standing outside of the teaching of the church or standing outside of grace, they are not to present themselves for Holy Communion, right? So they can still come to the church, they can still come to Mass, but they are not to receive Holy Communion if they are committing a sin that is obstinately against what we teach as Catholics. If someone is running some sort of immoral business or something, and they know that they are not following and being good to their employees or whatever, and yet they still present themselves for communion, that contradicts what we are called to be as holy. Or if someone is engaging in relationships that are unhealthy, an abusive relationship or whatever, you don't want someone abusing somebody on Saturday night and then coming to presenting themselves at the altar of grace on Sunday morning without having gone to confession, without having purified themselves from that sin. So that element is still there in our Catholic teaching, that we are called to be holy. And if we are not, then we are kind of cast out. We are cast out of the sacramental life because of the decisions that we have made. So that piece still exists in a little bit of a different sense, but we are still called to be a holy community, not a holier than thou community, but a holy community. So that is, we see this kind of beginning here in Leviticus and continuing through Numbers of what it means to be godlike. One of those aspects is to rest as God rested. And then we hear in 15, also chapter 37, we hear about those tassels on the cloak. And if we compare that, so here's like an example of a modern person with a phylactery with the word of God right there on their head, and the tassels there, those tassels were to remind them of all the commandments of God. And the idea is that's to remind them of the commandments. Put this on your head, have tassels on your cloak, so wherever you go, whatever you are doing, you are reminding yourself of the commandments. There was a group or kind of practice that was going around for a while. People were wearing rubber bands on their wrists. And every time they said a bad word, they would snap the wrist on the rubber band on their wrist to remind themselves, don't do that. Or sometimes it's good to, like on your computer, put a picture of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or to put the Divine Mercy chaplet on there or whatever, to remind yourself of what you are called to be, to have it right there in front of you all the time. If someone is struggling, for instance, with like pornography, I would sometimes recommend you need to have something, whatever screen is getting you there, put something holy on your screen as a reminder. No, don't do that. Or put a sticker on your computer or whatever. If you find yourself wasting time on all kinds of social media or something, put a sticker on your computer. Don't scroll or whatever. Those things are helpful for us to just remind ourselves. But those can get exaggerated. If we look at Matthew chapter 23, we hear Jesus referencing this part. And this had become a source of pride and letting everyone look at me for how good I am. And that's not the point of the tassels or the phylacteries. So 23 verse 5. It says, they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All of their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They make that bigger, and they just to see, look, I'm holy. Well, that defeats the purpose. They were to put, if you go back to read Numbers, they put these on as a penance and remind themselves, do not go against the law of God. It was meant to be a penitential practice, not a show everybody else how holy I am practice. All right, so then our journey moves on, and we move on then to the wilderness of Zin, or Sin, sometimes as it's called. And so there's a couple of things that happen that are important here. Miriam, the sister of Moses, dies here. And probably the most important thing here is this passage that happens in chapter 20, verse 11. Then raising his hand, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out in abundance for the community and their livestock to drink. This is the key event of why Moses himself does not enter into the Holy Land, is because he was disobedient to God. Now, the commentary, again, I recommend, again, this book by Petrie and Bergsma. It talks about this on page 242 about Moses's sin, and he clarifies this is not the first time that Moses went against God, but this is the most evident piece. So we think of Moses, he is this holy person all the time. No, not exactly. He had some other moments of disobedience, but this is kind of the culmination or the very clear piece of Moses's himself disobedience to God. Again, that's kind of the theme of Numbers, is the disobedience of the people versus God's providence and love and guidance. So Moses was given instructions to call forth water from the rock, and God would provide. It says in chapter 20, verse 8, he says, take the staff and assemble the community, you and your brother Aaron, in the presence of the order, and in their presence, order the rock to yield its waters. From the rock shall bring forth water for the community and for their livestock to drink. So Moses took the staff from his place as before the Lord, and he assembled the people, and he says, listen to me, you rebels, are we to bring water for you out of the rock? Then, raising his hand, Moses struck the rock twice. And so, again, it seems a little bit harsh for God to be so punishing, but this is just one event of several of Moses's disobedience, and you can read about that more in that commentary if you happen to have it. And it might seem like, well, gosh, God, you're being hard on Moses. Maybe he's getting a little hard of hearing. They didn't hear you right. You said staff, and maybe he just got confused on the instructions, and so he struck the staff. But God's instructions were, speak to the rock and let my power come forth. And Moses takes things into his own hands with his staff and then strikes the rock and then strikes it again. And I think it's especially that second time that really is what pushes it over the edge, right? What's that phrase? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you, or something like that. So, one time, okay. But going a second time, and that's just kind of like putting your heels on the ground and saying, I'm going to take this into my own hands and I am going to do it because look how powerful I am. So I think it's really that second strike that causes that separation. Side note, I kind of have a rule that I use all the time. One time for about anything, I'm good with. If it's a second or third time, then I start questioning. Like, someone asks in the parish, "Hey, can we do this?" And my general thing is, "Yeah, sure. Let's try it," or whatever. Or, "Hey, can you go and do a wedding over here in this other church?" And I'm sure I can do that. But then if it gets out of hand, then I will wonder. Or there's some problem that develops. I'm like, I'm not going to make a big deal out of one problem. If it happens again, then I will look at that. We had an instance actually that I applied this rule that I'm not going to. We had this group of people. I think that they were visitors to our church, group of young men. And they were not as good about wearing their mask at the mass as we asked them to. And one of them, I don't think even had a mask on at all. And then I think he was finally given one. They kind of wore it like down here. And because someone asked him to do that. So for the first time, I am presuming they are visitors, and one person or two not wearing their mask at the mass with all of our people spread out, I think we're going to be fine. If he comes back again and does the same thing, I'm going to have a word with him and say, look, these are the rules. But I'm not going to, go and chastise him for one thing. Maybe he didn't know any better, maybe whatever. And someone did have a word with him and talked with him, and that's great. But I'm not going to kick you out of the church for one offense. Do it again, and then I'm going to you're going to either have to leave or follow our rules. So one time, okay, I'll let it slide. Two times, no. That's kind of my general rule. And that's kind of what happens with Moses, I think. One time, maybe God would have let it slide. Okay, Moses, I said, talk to the rock. And if he would have gone, okay, sorry, I'm good. Rock, by the power of God, bring out the water. But no, he said, I'm going to do it again. So one time, maybe. Another time, no. So it's a major event that happens here. And this is what prevents Moses from going into the Holy Land. And at the end of Deuteronomy, it's quite sad. He is standing outside of the Holy Land looking in. I mentioned, not as kind of as a spoiler, but you've had 2 weeks. So they're the final of the Planet of the Apes movies. I had mentioned was very much, I mentioned this in the Exodus, very much is a Moses story, with Caesar the ape being a figure for Moses. And this is also one of the details that is really clever as well, the way that they tie that in. So the final of those the new Planet of the Apes movies, there were 3 of them, and they rise and fight and whatever. I don't remember of the Battle of the Planet of the Apes. I don't remember what the last one was called, but it was really pretty good. The first one I really liked, and it was very much like about vaccines and using these things to help like Alzheimer's and everything. And that's kind of what sets off this whole thing of talking apes and everything. That one was really good and some very poignant parts. The second one, I didn't really care for, but the third one was really good. And it's a Moses story. So, and that detail is there as well. Not too much of a spoiler, but there's that. All right, so Moses does not make it into the land. All right, so if we continue then on the journey, so that's kind of first part is the wilderness, and now we move into the next piece where they cross over into the land of Edom. Now, again, they're on their way to the star. They're on their way to the promised land. So they're going to cross through Edom. They're going to go around here this way and then cross over on the north side of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. And so they want to go through Edom and not to be a bother of at all. And the king of Edom says, no way, come and we will kill you. which is beautiful, because remember that Edom is seen as the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. And so remember in chapter 26 of Genesis, where Jacob was born holding on to Esau's heel, and then so Esau is the firstborn, and then Jacob cheats Esau out of his birthright. Remember how Esau was so hungry and he just wants that bowl of lentil soup? I'll take anything, and Jacob says, give me your birthright. And he says, fine, I'm just so hungry. Just give me the food. And then finally, Jacob tricks his father into giving the first son blessing to him instead of Esau. So here you have, on the one hand, the descendants of Esau, and on the other hand, all the sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes coming in, and they say, please let us pass. We won't do anything. We'll even pay for the water that we use. And Edom refuses. So talk about a grudge. We're going to hold on to this for generations. You took the birthright. You will not pass. So Edom refuses for them to pass through. So all of the descendants of Jacob have to reroute. It's like, okay, fine, we'll take the long way. So they go in a different path. All right, so then we have here in chapter 20 another piece where we have the death of Aaron also in this moment, where at the Mount of Hor, which is, I didn't put on the map, but on the edge of the land of Edom, that's where Aaron dies. There on the mountain. So that's another piece. So we lose another one of our characters. So we've lost Miriam, we've lost Aaron. And then right after the death of Aaron is when we have this important piece of the seraph serpent. So the people are grumbling again. That's what they do. And so the people are grumbling, why have you, against God and Moses, why have you brought us up from Egypt to die in this desert where there's no food or water? We are disgusted with this wretched food. And so God punishes them and sends them seraph serpents, which bit the people, and many of them died. And the people came to Moses and say, we have sinned, in complaining. So Moses prayed for the people, and then we hear about make a seraph and mount it on a pole, and if anyone is bitten looks at it, he will recover. So we have this scene where these serpents are seen again as a punishment from God. And remember, just a reminder, this can seem very strange for us as moderns, but reminder for the ancient people, God was in charge of everything. We as moderns tend to say, well, things just happen and whatever. But for the ancient people, they would say things don't just happen. Is God all powerful or not? So if something happens, then it comes from God. We have trouble with that. And so how do we balance those things is the great kind of struggle. Moderns tend to err on the side of things just happen, and ancients tend to focus on the side that everything happens and it happens from God. So if there are serpents, those came from God. If there's an earthquake, that came from God, and it was a punishment. That's how the ancients would think. That's not how we would think. We would think there was an earthquake. Well, natural things happen. That's the way it goes. So these serpents were sent from God, as we read in Numbers, and it was a great, terrible event. But then what is used is this serpent, then, this bronze serpent, is seen then as a reversal of the death that happened. This then becomes a beautiful symbol, not only for medical professionals, because you can see that little thing there, right? You see that that's the symbol for doctors, right? Which is interesting to have that symbol for doctors in this ancient piece of Numbers of this being recovering from an illness. But it also becomes a symbol for the cross, whereas something should be a curse, like these serpents were, instead becomes a source of blessing. So this becomes a prefigurement for the cross. Jesus is put to death on this instrument of torture, and that should be terrible. But then we say whoever looks upon the cross, will be saved, and we'll see that that is the means of salvation from what should have been the means to death. So this transformation of the serpent into not the vehicle of death, but the vehicle of life. So that happens there in this wilderness as well. All right. So then we continue along in our journey. And they pass by the Moabites and come near to the land of Ammon, right there. And that is where the Israelites have their first real battle. But they didn't start it. They didn't start the fire. But the Ammonites start the war with them. They simply asked for a simple request, like they asked of the Edomites. They said, we are just passing through. We're not going to take anything. We just want to pass through your land. But Sihon, king of the Amorites, says, no way. And so he advances against the Israelites. And according to the scriptural account, the Israelites dominate, devastate the Ammonites. So the Israelites were attacked, they defend themselves, and they slaughter those that came up against them. The next battle comes against Og, the king of the Amorites. And again, they don't start it. Og comes and attacks them, and they defend themselves. So, I'm sorry, Og is the king of Bashan. Sorry, not of the Amorites. Sihon was the king of the Amorites. So I'm not sure what they're doing way up there, and there is not exactly clarifications of where this battle took place. So Og, the king of Bashan, also attacks this advancing army, which, I mean, I guess they would, we've seen the numbers. They are huge numbers of people that are marching. So they've probably felt threatened, and so they attacked. And so, but they also lose there to the Israelites. So they end up finally on the plains of Moab, down there, right at the edge of Jericho. So the plains of Moab. And there are a few things that happen here. So that's where we end up here on this plain. And we have a couple details that happen here. One is we have this strange situation with Balaam, who is a powerful Moabite prophet. And again, a prophet means someone who speaks on behalf of. So Moab spoke on behalf of the gods. Balak is a prince of Moab who summons Balaam, and he wants to get rid of those Israelites who have come into their land. And so then he says to the prophet, he says, whatever you bless is blessed, whatever you curse is cursed. And so he sends Balaam to go out and curse the Israelites. But what happens is Balaam comes to know the true God, and Balaam, instead of becoming a mouthpiece of the Moab gods, becomes the mouthpiece of the real God. And so the lesson is that God's power even overpowers his enemies. You know, I think that's an interesting thing. And there's also this whole thing with the donkey, which is interesting. The donkey is talking. It's an interesting episode. It reminds me of, what is that, Midsummer Night's Dream, where Bottom becomes a donkey or something. It kind of has similarities there. But it's interesting also that unlike other ancient texts, we never hear conversations with God, the true God, and other gods, because those other gods don't exist. We hear of their prophets, but we never hear of like God talking with other gods. So it's very clear that from the beginning, that there was the understanding there is only one God, and the other gods don't actually exist. But they were worshipped. One of those, you're back with the Brick Testament, is Baal. Baal means bad god, and the Baal of Peor is a fertility god. Now this is going to be fun when I do it in Spanish right after this, and because Peor means worse, or the worst. El Peor means the worst, and this is the worst. El Peor. So Baal is a fertility god who we'll see show up a lot in the Old Testament. And worship the Baal of Peor meant engaging in sexual rites, or we hear sometimes of the sacred prostitutes. So when you hear someone say they submitted to the rites of Baal of Peor, that's kind of coded language there. That means they're doing some really nasty stuff, because they are submitting themselves to the rites of the Baal of Peor. And so this is really, really bad. They are going and doing all these kinds of things with their prostitutes and whatever. These are these people of God. And so as we have this here, there is this public execution there of those that followed the Baal of Peor. Again, the theme is holiness, and these have really separated themselves from holiness. Then we have a commercial break. Let me take the and now a message from our sponsor, and we hear about the second census. So sometimes, like as a show is going on television, like comes this like really exciting part and break. And okay, we'll be back, and then we continue along later. When we come back from our commercial break from the second census, the second counting of the people, then we hear about the Midianites conquered. And then what happens is the tribes of Gad and Reuben decided they've come far enough. We're not going any further. So they decide, Gad ends there. To watch my little details there, because Gad gets filled in, and then Reuben then gets filled in. So, and then half of Manasseh, they decide to settle in this land. And see, they're just right outside the promised land, They didn't quite cross over, but they have decided this is good enough for us. We aren't going to cross over the Jordan River into this land that God has given us. We will settle here. So it's outside of what the boundaries of what the promised land are supposed to be. So this is where the story basically ends for us at the book of Numbers. They are at the cusp, right at the edge of the promised land, and 2 of our tribes have settled, and 2.5. That's kind of the overarching story of Numbers. We see them pass from Sinai through the wilderness and into standing right at the edge, ready for battle. And that will be continued in the book of Joshua, because Deuteronomy will hear kind of a sermon. The final words and testament of Moses is Deuteronomy. And then the story really continues with Joshua. Not much happens in Deuteronomy. Moses dies, that's significant. But then we continue on basically with the story in Joshua. So we are ready to go. We're ready to enter into the promised land. And we're going to continue that story in Joshua. But there are a few other tidbits before we leave Numbers that I would like to touch base with. We hear about the Nazarites in chapter 6 of Numbers. And for the Nazarites, they have particular rules. So these are kind of a particular sect, a particular group of people within the Jewish, within the tribes that take this extra commitment to God. So they do not take any grape products. They do not cut their hair. While he is under the Nazarite vow, no razor shall touch his head. So more often than not, these rites, these promises, these vows were for a limited time, not for like their whole life. But we are going to see some famous Nazarites later. John the Baptist was known to be a Nazarite. He's probably the most famous, maybe. Or Samson. Remember the story of Samson, who has all that strength, and then he has his hair cut, and then he loses all of his strength. So they had no great products, they had no cutting of hair, and they had no contact with a corpse. The idea with the corpse there is that there was this idea in the olden times that evil came out from a corpse. But the Nazarites want to really avoid evil. So no great products, so they wouldn't ever get drunk, and no cutting of their hair, and no contact with a corpse. Possibly the most lovely part of all of Numbers is we have this priestly blessing, which you've probably heard before. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you and give you peace. That priestly blessing, it's beautiful. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you and give you peace. That comes from Numbers here, chapter 6, verse 24 and 26. Also significantly, we have the second Passover. And this is a big deal, I think, because, we think of the first Passover, and that's huge. But in some ways, the second Passover is even more important because that establishes what the Jewish people will be doing for the rest of their lives, that they will go forth remembering the power of God. So this is the first time that they reenact what happened. The first time it was for real, and now here is what they will be doing. And so I think, yes, one more important element is this idea of being guided by this cloud or this pillar of fire. So the idea is God was leading the people and through their journeys. And so during the day, there was this cloud, and during the night, there was this pillar of fire. The idea was this was the presence of God leading the people. So that's another important aspect from Numbers that we hear about. So lots of pieces here in Numbers. Again, it becomes a journey story. It can be read spiritually as our journey to the Holy Land, our journey to heaven, things standing in our way sometimes. Sometimes sin attacks us and we need to reject that and forcefully so that that does not enter into and infect the holiness to which we are called. Okay. So that is pretty much Numbers. Hopefully that has been helpful. And now I will unmute all or mute all, allow you to unmute yourself. So, are there then any questions about the book of Numbers? I think it's, I think it's exciting. It's as Karen was saying earlier, it is an exciting book as we are moving this journey and we're going someplace here, and this arrival to land right at the edge of the promised land. Karen was asking about wood in the wilderness. I had pictured this area as a lot of nothing. Well, there is enough. I mean, they have to have wood, I suppose, for fire sometimes. So there's probably not much wood, but I don't think it's like a desert, like we would think of a desert, like at the Sahara, but not like if like the deserts of Arizona or something, there's still some wood.
Yeah, I had been thinking about the fact that they didn't have any meat and they asked God to provide meat, and yet they have all of these animals for sacrifice and all that stuff. Well, the animals have to be able to graze or they will die. And
right.
So if they had some grazing land someplace, maybe they left the animals where they could graze and then they went out into the next area without the animals. I mean, just a thought. But then when it came up with the wood, I thought, well, if that's true, probably there's no wood.
Right. Yeah, it seems like, like a wilderness is like just kind of not good land for planting or maintaining life. It's the soil is not good. Mm-hmm. So some kind of weedy stuff, hardy stuff will grow, but not great trees and stuff. Not flowing with milk and honey. Lost tribes of Israel.
Yeah, I asked a friend of mine, a Jewish friend, about the lost tribes of Israel one time, and her only answer was, "Who cares? They've been gone forever." And so when I came across, when I came across this, I thought, well, maybe that's what they're talking about with these lost tribes of Israel, because they never crossed over, and so they just kind of fell away from the rest of them. Who knows? That was just a thought.
I don't know about that one.
Okay.
Any other questions? I'm also watching on the Facebook. If there's anything else here, I can check the YouTube. Questions, comments, thoughts?
On the ball and the prostitutes and things, it just struck me that those women probably, and maybe even men, I don't know, probably had no choice in what they were forced to do. I don't know. I just think there was a lot of times that people were forced into things that they didn't want to do.
Especially the women. especially.
Yeah. And I skipped past that part in chapter 5 that we hear about the ordeal for a suspected adulteress. Again, Petrie and Bergsma have a good commentary on that, about how, again, it's a movement from brutality to mercy. And we see this where the history brings us there. We don't immediately go from brutality to mercy and Jesus loves us and everything. That takes some time. And so what Petrie and Bergsma were talking about in their book was, in many ancient societies, there was no, the women really had no rights. And if someone suspected someone of adultery, well, you're gone, kill her. And in the Jewish society, it's actually a movement towards mercy, where that person would be brought to a trial, but the husband was removed and was not part of that. So you kind of got this idea of an objective judgment, which is a big movement, and we think that's still not very good. And where's the justice for the man or whatever? But it is a pretty big movement to move to an objective outside judge to judge that case. I mean, similarly, with the whole abuse thing that's gone on in our country, this idea of this independent review, so that you're not getting bishops and priests defending priests and bishops or whatever for their crimes or whatever. Do you take it to a independent lay, not even necessarily Catholic? Let's look at the facts and see what actually happened. So you don't have this kind of conflict of interest going on. That's that same kind of movement. So it's a movement to an objective judge. And it's going to continue to evolve, but we just kind of see that first piece here, which is neat. I think beautiful to see how we're moving.
I have to leave. Thank you again, Father. It was a very good presentation. I'm sorry I had to bounce in and out, but I've got a little problem this morning. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Carry on.
Bye.
Any other concerns or questions or things that came up?
I don't think so.
No, it was a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be, because I never
good.
read it before. Yeah,
Good. Glad to hear.
it's little stories.
Yeah, lots. Yes. All right. Well, thanks so much. And next week is Deuteronomy, our final book of the Pentateuch, and then we will take a little break until Lent. I think it's a 1 week break to get into Job. So.
Oh boy, Job.
Oh boy, Job. Yep.
I've been listening to Father Mike, and when he reads Job, I know I've read the book, but I'm still confused. I don't know that all of it's way over my head.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to do some
Maybe
big
you'll
old research.
bring it down for me here.
Right.
Hopefully. I mean, I think we know the general story of Job, the beginning and the ending, and the whole middle part is really long.
And very, the three friends and what they're
Right.
telling him, it's so confusing. And then what is
Right.
it? Elihu comes in, and then I'm like, oh my goodness, blowing my head up here. Okay.
All right. Well, very good. We'll see you next week then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Father. Bye.